Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. On the morning of September 12, 1907, a railway worker named Bertram Shaw returned to his lodgings in Camden Town, London. Inside the small rooms he shared with 22-year-old Emily Dimmock, he found a scene that would soon grip the entire country. Emily was lying dead in bed, her throat had been cut, and whoever had killed her appeared to have vanished without leaving behind any simple explanation of how or why they had come there. This became known as the Camden Town murder, a label that would eventually overshadow Emily herself. Newspapers printed lurid descriptions, speculated about her private life, and treated each new rumor as if it might solve the case. But beneath all of that noise was a narrow and troubling mystery. Emily had been alive the previous evening. Shaw had been away at work. Someone may have visited her during the night. By morning, she was dead. And no witness could reliably say who had entered the room, so let's back up a second. Emily Dimmock was living with Shaw in modest rented accommodation in North London. Their relationship was presented publicly as that of husband and wife, although they were not legally married. Shaw worked overnight shifts on the railway, which meant Emily was often alone in the rooms during the hours of darkness. Contemporary reports also described her as earning money through sex work, a fact the press used to reduce her life to a stereotype rather than understand her circumstances. Camden Town at the time was a place of sharp contrasts. Railway lines, workshops, crowded streets, public houses, and inexpensive lodgings sat close together. People moved through the neighborhood at nearly every hour. Privacy was limited, but anonymity was still possible. A stranger could be noticed and then forgotten. A familiar face might attract no attention at all. For investigators, that environment created a difficult question. Had Emily brought home someone she knew, or had an ordinary encounter turned unexpectedly violent? On the evening of September 11th, Emily was seen in local public houses. The surviving accounts do not create one perfectly continuous timeline, but they establish that she was out in Camden Town while Shaw was beginning his regular night shift. She spoke with people, moved through familiar surroundings, and appeared to be carrying on with an otherwise ordinary evening. Nothing any witness reported clearly suggested that she believed herself to be in immediate danger. Then at some point the reliable trail ended. Shaw was away throughout the critical period, working aboard the railway as expected. When he returned the next morning and entered the rooms, he discovered Emily in bed with a fatal wound across her throat. The police were called, and the lodging quickly became a crime scene. There was no modern forensic team, no genetic testing, and no secure system for preserving every trace. Investigators had fingerprints and medical examination, but those methods were limited, and crime scene practice varied considerably. The condition of the room raised questions without answering them. Investigators examined the bed, Emily's clothing, the available entrances, and the objects around her. They considered whether anything had been disturbed or taken. Yet there was no unmistakable sign pointing to a single motive. This did not look like a case that could be solved by finding one obvious weapon beside the body or one stranger's name written in plain sight. Instead, attention turned to Emily's recent contacts and personal correspondence, and that is where the postcard appeared. Among Emily's belongings was a card bearing a small drawing of a rising sun. It also contained an invitation to meet, written under a false name. In another case, it might have seemed like an ordinary private joke. Here, it became potentially crucial. If the writer had arranged to see Emily shortly before she died, then identifying that person could reveal one of her final meetings. Police began trying to trace the handwriting. The image of the rising sun gave the investigation a memorable symbol. Newspapers reproduced the card and encouraged readers to study the handwriting. That decision effectively turned the public into a vast, uncontrolled pool of amateur detectives. Tips and rumors followed. Some were useless. Others were based on resemblance rather than real knowledge. But the publicity eventually helped direct investigators toward a young commercial artist named Robert Wood, whose handwriting was said to resemble the writing on the postcard. Wood was not an unknown drifter with no connection to Emily. When questioned, he admitted that he knew her and acknowledged writing the card. He also admitted arranging a meeting while using a false name. Those admissions placed him inside the story, but they did not place him inside Emily's room at the time of the killing. Wood maintained that he had met her socially and had nothing to do with her death. The police, however, now had a suspect connected to a secretive invitation. Now here's where the distinction between suspicion and proof becomes essential. Writing the postcard showed that Wood had concealed his identity, at least on the card. It suggested a personal connection he might not have wanted openly discussed. But secrecy was not the same thing as murder. To build a criminal case, investigators needed to show more than embarrassment or dishonesty. They needed to establish that Wood had the opportunity to kill Emily and that the physical and testimonial evidence supported that conclusion. Wood's conduct nevertheless attracted further attention. Evidence emerged that he had spoken to an acquaintance about the postcard and had tried to shape what might be said about it. The prosecution later treated this as consciousness of guilt. The defense offered a less damning interpretation: a frightened young man, aware that a private meeting had suddenly become part of a notorious murder inquiry, might lie or ask others to lie because he feared scandal. A suspicious act could have more than one explanation. Police arrested Wood, and the case moved toward an inquest and then a trial. The medical evidence became central because the estimated time of death could either support or undermine the prosecution's theory. Doctors examined the wound and the condition of Emily's body, then gave opinions about when she had died, but estimating time of death in that era was imprecise. Temperature, digestion, physical condition, and the environment could all affect the conclusion. A medical estimate was not a clock. At the inquest, the wound itself was described in clinical detail. Testimony addressed its direction, severity, and whether the killer might have used a razor or another sharp instrument. Investigators also considered the relative positions of Emily and her attacker, yet those interpretations were contested. A wound can suggest a sequence of movements, but it rarely reconstructs every second with certainty. And without a weapon conclusively linked to a suspect, medical testimony could narrow possibilities while still leaving the killer unidentified. The absence of modern testing mattered enormously. Blood could be recognized, but it could not be matched through genetic profiling. Biological traces could be observed, yet investigators could not identify an individual from them with anything approaching today's precision. Fingerprint evidence was developing, but no decisive print connected Wood to the killing. In practical terms, the case depended on chronology, behavior, handwriting, witness recollection, and inference. Each part had some value. The problem was whether those parts formed one reliable picture. The prosecution's theory was that Wood had arranged to meet Emily, spent time with her, and later killed her in the Camden Town rooms. The Rising Sun postcard connected him to the planned encounter. His attempts to distance himself from it could be presented as evidence of guilt. Witness accounts were used to trace his movements and Emily's movements through the evening, but there was no eyewitness to the killing, no confession, and no direct physical evidence proving that Wood had been in the bedroom. Wood's defense focused on those missing links. His lawyers did not need to prove who killed Emily. They only needed to demonstrate that the prosecution had not proved Wood's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They challenged the estimated time of death and produced witnesses whose accounts complicated the suggested timeline. If Wood could be placed elsewhere during the likely period of the murder, or if the medical estimate remained uncertain, then the postcard alone could not carry the full weight of the charge. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in December of 1907. By then, public interest was intense. Crowds followed the proceedings, and newspapers reported not only the testimony but the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Wood was defended by Edward Marshall Hall, one of the most famous advocates of his time. Hall was known for speaking directly to juries and identifying uncertainty inside circumstantial cases. Here, he had plenty to work with, because nearly every important fact required interpretation. The prosecution emphasized that Wood had arranged a clandestine meeting with Emily and then behaved dishonestly once the postcard drew attention. Why use a false name? Why attempt to influence what another person might say? Why initially avoid a straightforward account of the meeting? Taken together, prosecutors argued these were not innocent coincidences. They suggested a man trying to hide his connection to a murdered woman, but the defense kept returning to a basic point: hiding an affair or avoiding scandal did not prove homicide. Witness testimony made the timeline more complicated rather than less. People who had been drinking in crowded public houses were asked to remember faces, conversations, clothing, and precise times from weeks earlier. Some accounts placed Emily with particular companions. Others addressed Wood's whereabouts. Memories that sounded firm under direct questioning could become uncertain during cross-examination. Even an honest witness might shift an event by half an hour, and in a case built around a narrow window, half an hour could change everything. There was also the question of how Emily's social life was being used in court. Her contacts with different men gave investigators several possible lines of inquiry. But they also allowed speculation to spread far beyond the evidence. The press frequently presented her as reckless or morally compromised. That framing was deeply unfair. Whatever arrangements Emily made to survive, she was the victim of a violent crime. Her private life could explain how she met people, but it did not make her death inevitable or understandable. Shaw's overnight work left him with a strong practical alibi, and nothing presented at trial established that he had secretly returned during the relevant hours. His role was instead that of the man who found Emily and raised the alarm. Even so, the existence of a shared room created uncertainty about access. Who knew Shaw would be away? Who knew where Emily lived? Would she have admitted a stranger or only someone familiar? The evidence did not provide a confident answer to any of those questions. The prosecution relied heavily on the idea that Wood had both access and reason to conceal his involvement, but motive remained indistinct. There was no single, clearly established dispute that explained the level of violence. Prosecutors could suggest jealousy, panic, or an argument, yet suggestion was not evidence. The defense did not have to offer a more convincing motive for someone else. It could simply point to the gaps, if the reason for the crime was unknown. Then Wood's connection to Emily remained ambiguous. Marshall Hall's defense also challenged the emotional pull of the postcard. It was vivid, recognizable, and easy for a jury to remember. But memorable evidence is not always decisive evidence. The card proved communication and an intended meeting. It did not record what happened afterward. It contained no threat. It did not show that Wood followed Emily home. And it certainly did not prove that he stood beside her bed with a weapon. The defense urged the jury not to mistake narrative neatness for certainty. This is one of the enduring difficulties with circumstantial cases. A series of suspicious facts can appear powerful when arranged in one order. Rearrange them, and a different picture emerges. Wood might have concealed the meeting because he was guilty of murder. Or he might have concealed it because the association itself could damage his reputation and expose him to police suspicion. His behavior mattered, but the jury had to decide whether it supported only one reasonable conclusion. The defense argued that it did not. The medical timeline became especially important during the final arguments. If Emily died within the period proposed by the prosecution, Wood's movements had to fit that window. Defense witnesses, however, gave evidence intended to place him elsewhere or make the chronology less certain. The doctors could not identify an exact minute of death. That left room for competing interpretations. When a person's life depends on the difference between possibility and proof, uncertainty in the clock can become uncertainty in the entire case. After hearing the evidence and the arguments, the jury retired to consider its verdict. Their deliberation lasted only about 15 minutes. They returned and found Robert Wood not guilty. The courtroom reportedly reacted with excitement, reflecting how closely the public had followed both Wood and his celebrated defense. Legally, the result was clear. The prosecution had failed to prove its case. The verdict did not declare that every suspicion surrounding Wood was mistaken. It declared that guilt had not been established beyond reasonable doubt. Wood left the court a free man. And he could not be tried again on the same evidence under the law as it then operated. No other person was convicted of Emily's murder. With the leading suspect acquitted, the investigation lost its central theory, while the weaknesses exposed at trial remained. The postcard had led police to a real acquaintance, but it had not led them to a legally proven killer. Emily's final hours were still broken into fragments, separated by gaps that no witness could fill. Over time, writers proposed alternative suspects and new interpretations. Some argued that Wood had escaped conviction because the defense successfully created doubt. Others believed the acquittal was entirely justified and that investigators had focused too quickly on the most visible lead. There were also attempts to reinterpret the wound, the room, and the accounts of Emily's movements. But later theories faced the same basic problem. The surviving evidence is incomplete. Filtered through Edwardian reporting and sometimes inconsistent even in contemporary records. The Rising Sun postcard remains at the center of the case because it offers something concrete in a mystery filled with uncertainty. We know it existed. We know Wood wrote it. We know it arranged contact under a false name. What we do not know is whether that contact had any direct connection to the killing. The card may have identified Emily's murderer. Or it may simply have exposed one private meeting while the true killer remained elsewhere, unnoticed and ultimately untraced. And then there are Emily's final movements. Witnesses saw her in public, but no surviving account follows her continuously from the public houses to her room. We do not know exactly when she returned, whether she returned alone or whether someone arrived later. We do not know whether the visitor was expected. Those missing transitions matter more than any dramatic courtroom exchange. Somewhere inside them is the point where an ordinary night changed into a homicide, and that moment was never reliably reconstructed. The case also shows how quickly a victim can disappear behind the person accused of killing her. Robert Wood's arrest, his personality, his defense, and his acquittal dominated public attention. Emily became an image in newspaper columns, the young woman in Camden Town, the subject of a notorious postcard, the body at the center of a legal spectacle. Yet she had relationships, routines, anxieties, and hopes that the record barely preserved. The unresolved question is not merely who committed a famous crime, but who ended Emily's life. More than a century later, there is no responsible way to turn the surviving material into certainty. Wood may continue to attract suspicion, but an acquittal and an incomplete evidentiary record cannot be replaced by confident hindsight. The forensic testimony had limits, the witnesses had limits, the timeline had limits. What remains is a carefully documented prosecution that looked persuasive to some observers, a defense that exposed reasonable doubt, and a jury that reached its decision with remarkable speed. So the story ends where it began, in a small Camden Town room on the morning of September 12, 1907. Bertram Shaw returned from work. Emily Dimmock was dead. A postcard decorated with a rising sun offered investigators a path but not a final answer. Robert Wood was tried and acquitted, no one else was convicted, and Emily's murder remained officially unsolved. The sun drawn on that card rose over a planned meeting. What followed after darkness fell is still unknown. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.